Jason, and today I'm here to instruct you on how to run the TruStructures strain gauge lab system. Let's get started by plugging in the load cell to the box. On the back side, we have a 4-pin plug that fits in together, and you screw it right into the back. Once your system is plugged into the proper 110 or 220 system that you have, you can turn the box on. This here is the main frame of the TruStructures system. On this end we have the tang end with the bolts that will hold down the test pieces. On the center section here we have some displays of how the calculation works. And on this end we have the slide bar where the load cell is mounted. And then the crank assembly system, which will push load into what you're trying to analyze. This is the basic I-beam for the test system. Of course, on the end you can see that there is an I-beam, and we do have a case over top of the strain gauges so you can see the strain gauges. Let's put this into the machine. The I-beam mounts onto the tang through the block, and then you screw in the 4 mounting bolts into their holes. You may have to wiggle a little bit to get them started. Once you get all 4 started, you can crank them down. Hold up on the end, or you can have someone assist you, and then tighten in the 2 bolts on the end, doing the top one first and then just snugging up the bottom one. Once the I-beam is mounted, you can plug in the 24-pin plug to the I-beam from the box. Once that is plugged in, you can now turn the box on. Once you have the plug pinned in, then you can slide the load cell bar over to where the center of the I-beam is, and then tighten the bar back down. Now you can see the load cell is centered underneath the I-beam. Once the I-beam has been plugged in for 5 to 10 minutes to allow the strain gauges to acclimate themselves, you can start taking the unloaded strain sensors. You write down the first one, first channel of channel A, and then keep switching and let it settle out, and then you can keep writing them down. You go all the way through to channel G on the I-beam. Once you have all the readings wrote down, you can turn your crank up till your load cell just barely touches the bottom of the I-beam. You can take your first reading for the deflection for the bottom part. Once you have that wrote down, you can start cranking in the number of pounds that you want to put in as a load on your strain gauges. I like to do 50 pounds. Once it has settled out to 50 pounds, you take your second reading for your deflection. Once the load has settled out to the number of pounds that you need or want to use, you can start writing down your loaded strain numbers. Going channel by channel, all the way up to channel G. Once you have all your readings wrote down on the loaded, you can now crank the load out of the system. And once the load is cranked out, you can unplug the box and take the I-beam off of the test unit. This is the tube, and you notice that the strain gauges are visible in a clear tubing case. You now can crank in the tube up against the tang like we did with the I-beam. You may have to wiggle a little bit to find the holes to allow the studs to go in. Loosely tighten the bolts, hold up firmly on the far end, and tighten down. You're now ready to plug in the 24-pin plug to the connection. Once that's plugged in, you can turn the box on. The first thing we will do with the tube is a bending with a block on the end of the tube. Slide the tube in, or the bolt in, onto the pins, start threading the bolt in. Use a 5/16 Allen wrench to tighten the bolt down. Now you can position the load cell directly under the center of the block. Tighten down the bolt for the angle for the load cell by turning on this lever. Once the load cells have acclimated for 5 to 10 minutes, we can start by writing down the unloaded strain numbers. The tube goes all the way up to channel H. Next, you want to tear out your load meter and crank till the load cell just barely comes to the bottom of the block. You can write down your first number for your deflection. Make sure your meter is tared out and start cranking in a load. Once your desired load is reached, you can write down the second deflection number. Now that you have your load in, you can write down the loaded strain numbers. All the way up to channel H. Once you have your loaded numbers wrote down, you can now crank the load out of the system and get ready for the next test. Now you can remove the block from the end of the tube. For the next test, we will put on the yoke. You can take the tube off and leave the box plugged in to leave the strain gauges on. You can have someone hold the piece for you, or you can lay it down on top of the machine to put the yoke on. Now we can slide the yoke onto the crank end of the frame. It slides over, and there's two holes, threaded holes for the bolts to go into. Loosely tighten the bolts until we put the tube into the yoke. Now you can slide the tube end, the hub end, into the yoke bearing. All the way. Then you can tighten your nuts on the tang end. Once the tang end bolts are tight, you can finish tightening the yoke bolts. Now we can attach the torque arm to the end of the tube. Slide the bolt in and mount on the pins just like we did with the block. And tighten down using your Allen wrench. Now you can adjust the load cell to where you would like to position it out onto the torque arm. Once you are positioned, use the crank handle and tighten back down. Now you can take the unloaded readings for the tube, channels A through H. Now you can crank the load cell close to the bottom of the torque arm and tear out your box so that it reads 0. Now you can write down your first deflection number. Once you have that wrote down, you can crank in your desired load. Once your desired load is reached, you can write down your second deflection number. Now you can record your loaded data, your strain numbers, onto your sheet. Channels A through H. Now you can take the load out of the tube and use your Allen wrench and take the torque arm off of the end of the tube. The next test will be the combination bend. So now we have to take the yoke off, the tube off, and reattach the tube and the torque arm back to the tube. Reattach the torque arm back onto the tube like you did before. Hold on to the torque arm and tighten down using the Allen wrench. Now you can reposition the load cell to where you would like it on the torque arm from the center of the bolt on the tube. Crank the load cell up next to the bottom of the torque arm and write down your first deflection reading. Now we can write down the unloaded strain numbers off the meter. Follow channels A through H. Now we can crank in our desired load. Once your desired load is reached, you can now write down the strain numbers. Channels A through H. Now you can unload the tube and take everything off. Now we are going to attach the airfoil section to the frame. We will need a helper for this because the wing is heavy. Once all the bolts are loosely tightened, you can crank them all down with the person on your helper on the end, raising it up to allow for less deflection. You will have your partner on the end raising it up to take the deflection out of the wing while you're tightening down all the bolts. Now you can plug the 24-pin plug into the wing and turn the box on. Now you can align the load cell with the front spar of the wing and tighten down. Once the strain gauges are acclimated, You can now write down the strain numbers off the box using all the channels A through L. Now you can line the load cell up with the bottom of the angle bar on the wing and tear out your meter at 0. Once that is done, you can write down your first deflection number. Now we can crank in our desired load onto the wing. Once your desired load is reached, you can now write down your second deflection number. Now we can record our loaded readings on our strain gauges, channels A through L. Now we can crank out the load from our wing. We can slide our load cell out to the far end or to the edge of the rear spar of the wing to get a torsion bend on the wing. Once you have all your desired strains and loads as to where you would like to place them on the wing, you can remove the wing and take all your numbers to the strain gauge calculator. Now we can take our strain loads and numbers from the sheets and put them on the strain gauge calculator on the computer. Once you've pulled it up on your computer, you type in your gauge factor that is from your factory run data sheet. Now you can click on the unloaded and start typing in your numbers. Once you have typed all of your unloaded and loaded strain voltage numbers into the calculator, you can press the calculate button at the bottom of the page. All of your calculated strain values will be displayed in the strain column. Thank you for using the TruStructure system from Turbine Technologies, and if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to call us or email us.